Hello. The purpose of this lecture is to repeat most of the information that I will be covering in the second day of class. So this lecture is designed for people who join class late, who miss class on the second day, or who just want to review this complex information one more time. This lecture won't make a whole lot of sense if you have not already watched the lecture from the first day of class. So I suggest you watch that lecture before you watch this one. What we're going to be doing today is talking about how to complete the more complicated part of your individual play assignments. I explained last class where to find these assignments. I asked you all to print your assignment off of Canvas. I asked you to put your name on the assignment. I asked you, and this is very important, to put the page number in our textbook, the David Bevington edition, the page number where your assignment occurs. I asked you to number the lines of your assignment. I asked you to proofread your assignment against the textbook, and I asked you to begin the process of paraphrasing. And I described how to do that in my first lecture. What we're going to talk about today, therefore, is the second page of this assignment. This page, as I said last class, begins life as a blank page. And on that blank page, you're going to write the answers to the text analysis questions that appear on page 8 of our syllabus. So let's go to our syllabus and review these questions together. As it says here, students must answer all the following questions about their piece. If the piece is in verse, they must also scan the speech as in the example on page 9. So the example on page 9 shows these scansion marks. The dash is the unstressed syllable, thus the X is the stressed syllable. So a regular line of iambic pentameter, and this first line is regular. Now entertain conjecture of a time. Dash X, dash X, dash X, dash X, dash X. That is the most common scansion you're going to see. That is a regular line of iambic pentameter. Most of the lines are regular. That's more so in 3354, but even here in later Shakespeare, more than 50% of the lines will go dash X, dash X, dash X, dash X, dash X. Now, if we look at the sample assignment that another student did, you'll see that he used those same scansion marks, and once again, most of these lines are completely regular. Lo she is one of this confederacy. Dash X, dash X, dash X, dash X, dash X. That is what is meant by scansion, and that's where you'll put the scansion, is right on the same page that you print from Canvas is where you're going to write your scansion marks. So what I ask here in the syllabus is your piece written in verse or prose? If prose, skip to question 4. So if your piece is prose, you don't have to bother with scansion. So prose pieces are much easier. So students sometimes try to convince me that their pieces are prose when they're actually verse. So how do we know? How do we know whether something is verse or prose? Well, the question of why something is verse or prose is fairly complicated. Comic characters tend to speak in prose. Lower class characters, servants, who also often happen to be comic characters, tend to speak in prose. We sometimes fall into the trap of thinking that prose is somehow more natural than verse, but Peter Hall made the exact opposite argument. He said that when characters in Shakespeare speak verse, it's completely natural because it's completely honest, revealed thought, simply flowing from their heart right out of their mouths in perfectly formed lines of iambic pentameter. When characters speak prose in Shakespeare, they tend to be telling something other than the total absolute truth. A lot of the comedy with prose characters comes from them using big words that they don't really understand. Bottom does this, Dogberry does this, Falstaff does this, using big fancy language to impress people. That's where a lot of the comedy comes from. So prose often involves some degree of obfuscation. This is certainly true of Iago, who we're going to see in the first play we read, because it's true of Iago that he speaks the truth in verse and lies in prose. The professor said in a perfectly formed line of iambic pentameter, he speaks the truth in verse and lies in prose. So why something is verse or why it's prose is a fairly complicated question. Whether something is verse or prose can be answered almost immediately in most cases. When a piece is written in verse, the first word in each line begins with a capital letter, regardless of punctuation. When a passage is in prose, capitalization follows punctuation, just like it does in the writing we do every day, right? The word will only be capitalized if it's at the beginning of a sentence. When it's verse, the first word in each line is capitalized. Occasionally you'll get assignments that are tricky because they'll have dialogue. One character is speaking verse, one character is speaking prose. Sometimes they're very short lines, so they all begin with a capital letter, whether they're verse or prose. So it can at times be confusing. But what you're looking for is, if the first word in each line begins with a capital letter, it is verse. And if the first word in each line does not begin with a capital letter, it is prose. Next question. If it's verse, is it written in iambic pentameter or in another scheme? If another scheme, which one? I'm going to say 95% of Shakespeare's verse is iambic pentameter. There's only one other form we're going to see this semester. That form has both a complicated name and an easy name. The easy name is the language of magic. And it's called the language of magic because this is used typically either by supernatural characters or by mortal characters casting supernatural spells. Okay? An example of this is Puck at the end of A Midsummer Night's Dream. If we shadows have offended, think but this and all is mended. Okay, so the technical name for that is trochaic tetrameter. Because iambic pentameter means there's 5 feet. Iambic means each foot is an ion, an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. So as we've already seen, a regular line of iambic pentameter goes da 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 dash x dash x dash x dash x dash x. Trochaic tetrameter, on the other hand, it's tetrameter, so there are only 4 feet, and each foot, rather than being an iamb, unstressed, stressed, is a trochee, stressed, unstressed. So a line of trochaic tetrameter goes da 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 x dash x dash x dash x dash. Okay, as in that speech by Puck. If we shadows have offended, think but this and all is mended. Then it drops from that 8-syllable form to a 7-syllable form, which makes it catalectic. Catalectic trochaic tetrameter, 7 syllables. That you have but slumbered here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. While these visions do appear, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Catalectic trochaic tetrameter, or, more simply, the language of magic. We're only going to see that in one play this semester. Only a couple of you will have assignments written in that format. So the big thing we need to worry about most of the time is iambic pentameter. So number 3, if it's written in iambic pentameter, how regular is the verse of your piece? Okay? Because almost everything this semester certainly, any speech of any length is going to have some lines that are irregular. None of the plays this semester are written in perfectly regular iambic pentameter, as was the case with Romeo and Juliet in 3354. When and how does it employ feet other than iambs? Remember, iamb dash x, unstressed, stress. The x is the stressed syllable. That's how we're going to do it in this class. Some people do it the other way, with the X is the unstressed syllable. Doesn't make any sense to me because I was a drummer in high school, and X is where you hit. So X is the stressed syllable, especially spondees, 2 X's, and trochees, X dash, stressed, unstressed. Are there any short lines, less than 10 syllables, 11-syllable lines, which could be either a feminine ending or a feminine caesura? Don't panic. I'm going to explain what those terms are in a minute. 12-syllable lines, which could be either feminine ending plus feminine caesura or hexameter, or longer lines over 12 syllables. See page 8, and I stand corrected. That should actually be page 9 for examples of these verse lines. Okay, so let's do that now. Let us go to page 9 and look at these examples here. Now, the first one is the most important, and I know this is new to many of you. I know this can be confusing. I know it can seem overwhelming. When students get in trouble, it's because they try to make it more complicated than it is. Look for a regular line of iambic pentameter, which we have here. Dash X, dash X, dash X, dash X, dash X. Da-da, 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 da-da. That is a regular line of iambic pentameter. Now, 3354, it should be easy, because about 75% of the lines are regular. This semester, by the time we get to Antony and Cleopatra, it's probably only 51% of the lines that are regular, but that's still a majority of lines. Majority of lines, dash X, dash X, dash X, dash X, dash X. Okay? So this assignment is graded pass-fail if you turn in your assignment and its verse, and less than half the lines go dash X, dash X, dash X, dash X, dash X, you've done it wrong. You're going to fail. Most of the lines are regular. Now, how do you know if a line is regular or not? This is harder for some people than others. And it's harder because some people, and this is a technical term that we use in Shakespeare studies, some people ain't got no rhythm. So what we're going to do now is a little exercise about finding the iambic rhythm. And the first thing you need to understand is the only way you're going to know how a line scans, you have to read it out loud. Okay, Shakespeare's plays are not literature. By which I mean they were not written to be read. They were written to be performed. So you cannot understand, you cannot successfully do any aspect of this textual analysis assignment without reading the pieces aloud. So that's what we're going to do momentarily. We're going to look at a regular speech. Now, almost no speech of any length is going to be perfectly regular. This one is certainly more regular than most. This is the opening speech of Romeo and Juliet. This speech will yield 10 syllables per line if we make 2 small elisions. The word piteous, that we would normally say as 3 syllables, we're going to just say as pitches, 2 syllables. And the word continuance, that we would normally say as 4 syllables, we're going to read as continuance, 3 syllables. If we make those 2 changes, we'll have 10 syllables per line. Technically, the word bury here would be a trochee, because we wouldn't say doth with the death bury their parents' strife. But for the purposes of this exercise, we're going to act as if it's all completely regular. So it all goes da-dun, 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 da-dun. Dash X, dash X, dash X, dash X, dash X. So what I want you to do, carefully, without spilling your cappuccino or stepping on your cat, is I want everybody to stand up. Okay? Now you probably can't see my head at this point. Yeah, there you go. You kind of see my head. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk in place. And we're going to read this speech aloud. Now, first of all, I'm going to do just the sounds, no words. So don't do anything yet, just watch me. Da-dun, 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 da-dun. Okay, now do it with me. And da-dun, 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 da-dun. Now, using the marks we're going to be using this semester, watch me first, don't do it. dash x, dash x, dash x, dash x, dash x. All together with me? Dash x, dash x, dash x, dash x, dash x. Good. Now we're going to do that same thing as we speak the words of the speech. So don't do it yet, just watch me. Do households both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene. Okay? So let's all do that together. And to households both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene. From ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured piteous overthrows doth with their death bury their parents' strife, the fearful passage of their death-marked love, and the continuance of their parents' rage, which but their children's end not could remove, is now the 2 hours traffic of our stage, the which, if you with patient ears attend, what here shall miss our toil shall strive to mend. Okay? That's the regular iambic pattern. Okay? Now, obviously, if you are an actor, and a lot of the work we're doing in this class is the same work that I do with actors in rehearsal when I direct, or that I do myself as an actor when I perform, you're not going to read it. You're not going to get on stage and say, two households both alike in dignity. We're exaggerating the rhythmic pattern, but that rhythmic pattern is there. That is the heartbeat of Shakespearean verse. That is regular iambic pentameter. Not all lines, however, are regular. As I said before, about half are regular, half are some kind of variations. What we have here next on the syllabus are the most common variations. And the first and most common variation is the feminine ending. Feminine ending, a regular line of iambic pentameter that has an extra unstressed syllable at the end of the line. So regular line goes da-dun, 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 da-dun. Feminine ending, da-dun, 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 Okay? This is the most common variation in Shakespeare. The most famous line in all of Shakespeare contains a feminine ending. To be or not to be, that is the question. So this is very common. So as I said, probably 50% of the lines are regular. Feminine endings, 20-25% of the lines. So that means that between 70 and 75% of the lines are going to be one of these first two forms here. Either a regular line or a feminine ending. Okay? That's what you're looking for. Don't make it harder than it is. Now, there are other irregularities that we're going to encounter. One of which, that students who take 3354, we don't really see that much before 1601, but we do see quite a bit of it this semester. Is called the feminine caesura, okay, which is also an 11-syllable line, but the extra syllable, instead of coming at the end of the line, as it does with the feminine ending, comes in the middle of the line before a piece of internal punctuation. So look at this line. If we took out the second syllable in difference, we'd have a regular line. To serve in such a diff, what devil wast. Instead, we say to serve in such a difference, what devil was. So when it's a feminine caesura, and this is important, after the internal punctuation, okay, because most of these lines in Shakespeare's mature verse, the punctuation doesn't come consistently at the end of the line. It comes in the middle of the line. So what we're going to talk about in a minute when we talk about enjambment, right? So we take, after that internal punctuation, the first syllable is unstressed. We go back to the iambic pattern. To serve in such a difference, what devil wast. It's important to understand whether the line is a feminine ending or a feminine caesura, because if it were a feminine ending, we would read, to serve in such a difference, what devil wast. You hear I'm putting the stress on the wrong syllable? kind of sounds like, the voice machine of the late Stephen Hawking. That's what happens when you misscan the lines. Next, we have two examples of 12-syllable lines. The first one contains both the feminine ending and the feminine caesura. So in this line, if we took out the second syllable in sorrow and the third syllable in persever, we'd have a regular line. To do obsequiesa but to persev, instead to do obsequiesaro but to persever. Feminine ending plus feminine caesura. Then we have a hexameter, which is also a 12-syllable line, but it's iambically regular. It just has an additional sixth foot. That father lost his, and thus survive would be regular, so we just add an extra foot. That father lost his, and thus survive are bound. That's a hexameter. So those are the exceptions. But what I can't stress this enough. What you're looking for are the rules. You want to see as many lines as possible will conform to either the standard line of iambic pentameter or to the feminine ending. You're not looking for problems, you're looking for solutions. There will be problems, there will be lines that do not scan, but you want to try to make the lines scan. That is our mission. Also, there's a discussion of end-stopped lines versus enjambment. This is mostly here because at some point Susan Morrison is going to ask you to take a quiz on literary terms that we ask all graduating students to do as part of assessment coming out of the English department. So I'm duty bound to make sure you know the difference. End stop lines are when the punctuation comes at the end of the lines. Enjambment is when the punctuation comes in the middle of the lines. You don't need to note this on your text analysis because Shakespeare's verse, particularly in the plays we're reading this semester, is typically enjambed. It's worth noting if there are a lot of end-stop lines because that's unusual. It's not really worth noting if there's a lot of enjambment because that is the rule rather than the exception with Shakespeare's later verse. But I do want you to understand how this relates to your paraphrase because students very often, it's human nature, you want to stop reading when you get to the end of the line, but often that isn't where the sense ends. Because look at this sentence. You cannot call it love, for at your age the heyday in the blood is tame. That would stand as an independent clause, but you cannot call it love, for at your age, that's not an independent clause. You can't paraphrase that by itself. Okay? You need to paraphrase the whole sentence, or in the case of very long sentences, break it up at independent clauses, which are typically noted by semicolons or occasionally commas. Okay? But when there's no punctuation, don't stop reading and don't try to break off the thought there and paraphrase it, because it won't make any sense. You've got to think of this in terms of sentences rather than lines. Poetically, we think in terms of lines, but in terms of sense, we need to think in terms of sentences. Alrighty. Let us go back. If the piece is dialogue, are there any shared lines or stickomythia? Shared lines are when one character starts speaking and another character finishes. It's a 10-syllable line, but it's broken between two speakers. You can tell that I think it's a shared line because I have indented the line of the second speaker. So it's important you understand the difference between short lines and shared lines. Short lines indicate a pause. Shared lines indicate no pause. One character starts the line, the other one finishes it. One reason productions of Shakespeare are far too long today is because people have the American actor's disease and they like to pause. They pause at times they shouldn't. So we need to understand the difference between a shared line and a short line. Stickomythia, one character speaks a 10-syllable line of verse, the next character speaks a 10-syllable line of verse. Question number 4. Does your piece rhyme? If so, what is the rhyme scheme? So if we look at the speech that here it is. If we look at the speech that we just marched in place together, we will see that this has a rhyme scheme. It goes A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, G, G, which means it is a sonnet. And in particular, it is an English or Shakespearean sonnet. This play comes from Romeo and Juliet. We think he wrote this play not too long after he wrote the sonnets. There are a lot of sonnets in the play. The play begins with the sonnet, ends with the sonnet. Romeo and Juliet meet each other for the first time. They spontaneously compose a sonnet. That's how we know they're in love. Other than the sonnet, often you will encounter rhyming couplets. Sometimes you'll have entire scenes or speeches that rhyme. Occasionally you'll have a rhyming couplet just appearing out of nowhere at the end of a speech. That rhyming couplet is there to signal typically an entrance or an exit, because we don't know too much about Shakespeare's company, but we know they didn't rehearse much. Okay, so actors barely knew their own lines. They certainly didn't know anybody else's. So, and I've done as an experiment, a production where we tried to recreate the play using part scripts where nobody had a whole version of the script. All you had was your side, your lines, and your 3 or 4 word cues. And you'd be backstage, waiting for when's my entrance, when's my entrance. I'd hear the rhyming couplet. That's your entrance. So often you'll have rhyming couplets that serve that function. Often we'll have longer patterns of A-B, alternating that don't quite form a sonnet. Number 5. Does your piece employ long and or short vowel and consonant sounds in a significant manner? Boy, this question confuses students. It confuses them so much, at times I've been tempted to no longer ask this question, but it's so important, I can't let it go. But the reason we have so much trouble with this is because in the English department we don't do much work with sound. We don't do much work with phonetics. So the question does not ask about vowels as they appear on the page. It asks about vowel sounds, because this is English. The letter A can be pronounced 9 different ways. The letter E can be pronounced 12 different ways. It's English. The only way to know if the sounds are the same is to read it out loud. Long vowel sounds are the Italian vowels, which are also basically the Spanish vowels. A, E, O, U, and the diphthongs I and ow. Those are long vowel sounds. A, I, E, the typically American vowel, those are short vowel sounds, and especially the schwa vowel. You can have whole conversations in American English just using the schwa vowel. Hey, how are you? I'm good, how are you? Okay? So long vowels and short vowels. Now it does not ask, are there any long vowels and short vowels? Because there always will be. It asks, does it use long and or short vowel and consonant sounds in a significant manner? So for instance, for vowels, one example in Comedy of Errors, the play opens with this very long series of speeches by Aegean, who describes his journey around the world, and after 5 or 8 pages he comes to his peroration, and summing up his journey he says, 5 summers have I spent in furthest Greece, roaming clean through the bounds of Asia. I would suggest that is the significant use of long vowel sounds, lots of long vowels in a row for poetic effect. Consonants, you've got the short consonant sounds are plosive consonants, where you can't hold on to the sound. Ba, da, pa, ka. Okay? Long consonant sounds are ones where you can hold on to the sounds. M, N, L, F, S, V, V. Those are long consonant sounds. Short consonant sounds are often angry sounds. It's no accident that most of our archetypal Anglo-Saxon swear words have lots of cuss and bucks and duck, right? So when Hamlet says, now could I drink hot blood, that, or when Titus says, I will grind your bones to dust, that arguably is the significant use of short consonant sounds. But again, I'm not asking if there are any long or short sounds. I'm asking, are they being used in a significant manner? The answer can be no. But if it's yes, tell me how. I also ask if it uses alliteration or assonance. Alliteration, we all know, the repetition of consonant sounds. Assonance, the repetition of vowel sounds. So rhyme also, by definition, includes assonance, but often with rhyme you've got not just the final vowel sound, but then an additional consonant sound. Number 6, state when and how your piece employs any of the following rhetorical devices. And the first is personification, the representation of an object or abstraction in human form or as an imaginary being. And the example here comes from Romeo and Juliet, where the chorus says, "Now old Desire doth in his deathbed lie." He's talking about Romeo's former affection for Rosaline, who now he met Juliet. He forgets all about Rosaline. So Romeo's old desire for Rosaline is described as an elderly patient on his deathbed. That is personification. Next one is apostrophe, when someone absent or dead or something non-human is addressed as if it were alive and present and was able to reply. This example also comes from Romeo and Juliet, and it actually combines apostrophe and personification. Juliet is actually speaking to the personified figure, and the personified figure she's speaking to here is Lady Fortune. So she says, "Fortune, all men call thee fickle." It's exactly the same thing Sky Masterson does in Act 4 of Guys and Dolls when he says, "They call you Lady Luck." That's apostrophe, speaking to the absent figure. And we know it's apostrophe because it uses thee, which is the object form of the pronoun thou. So this is a good opportunity to talk about thou and you. Thou and you correspond roughly with the Spanish tú and usted. One is familiar, one is formal. It's actually even more analogous with the French tu and vous, because the formal singular is also the plural. Okay, thou and you. One is familiar, one is formal. Many students think thou is formal because it sounds formal to us, because we only hear it in Shakespeare or if we go to church. Okay, but it's actually the familiar form. Typically, one uses thou when you're speaking down to someone, to servants, to children, to people beneath your status. The great exception is apostrophe. Whenever you're speaking to someone or something that isn't physically present, you speak with the thou form. That is why we say, if you still go to church, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name," using the thou form. Now, you think he's God, he's top of the food chain. If anybody deserves the formal form, it would be God. But because God is not physically present in the room with us, regardless of your religious beliefs, he's not just sitting right there, we use the thou form in apostrophe. Another time thou is used is if a character dies. So if a character was dead, you're speaking to the dead body, you always use the thou form. It's one of the most poignant moments for me in Hamlet. Hamlet has really only one friend, Horatio. They're very close friends, but Horatio always calls Hamlet you, because Hamlet is the prince. He never dares call him thou. He only calls him you, because even though they're friends, Hamlet is above him in station. It's not till the end of the play, when Horatio cradles the dead Hamlet in his arms, that he allows himself to say, "Good night, sweet prince. Flights of angels sing thee to thy rest," using the thou form in apostrophe because Hamlet is dead. Next, we have the oxymoron, or as our British friends sometimes call it, oxymoron. A figure of speech in which two contradictory words or phrases are combined to produce a rhetorical effect by means of a concise paradox. In other words, there are two words right next to each other that contradict each other. In the examples here from Romeo and Juliet, there are a lot of oxymorons in Romeo and Juliet, because one thing Romeo and Juliet does is it critiques and celebrates the Petrarchan sonnet tradition, and the Petrarchan oxymoron was a commonplace of that system. So early in the play, Romeo says, "Oh, brawling love, oh, loving hate." The words contradict each other. Later on in the play, when Juliet is angry with Romeo, she calls him in apostrophe, speaking to him when he's not actually there, "Oh, beautiful tyrant, fiend angelical." The words contradict each other. I could think of modern examples, words going together that contradict each other. Academic excellence, jumbo shrimp, President Trump. Words that just never went together. Okay, now we've got metonymy and synecdoche. Now these two are related, and life's short. Let's not get into a spitting contest about whether a given figure is metonymy or synecdoche. Synecdoche is a subset of metonymy. All synecdoche is also metonymy. So metonymy is a figure of speech in which the name of one thing is used in place of something else with which it is associated, as in the phrase, the pen is mightier than the sword. It's kind of symbolism. The pen symbolizes intellectual activity, the sword symbolizes brute force. A subset is synecdoche, in which a part signifies the whole or vice versa. So, for instance, when Cleopatra says she has a fleet of 20 sail, where sail stands in for the entire ship, that's synecdoche. We also have an example here of what I call, and I made up this term, but it's useful and we need to call it something because it happens a lot in Shakespeare. When the leader of a political entity, a country or a dukedom, is called by the name of the place that they lead. So Antony says to Cleopatra, "Whither hast thou led me? Egypt." She is the queen of Egypt, so he calls her Egypt. We're going to hear that in King Lear a lot. They say, "Where is France?" Not "where is the country," but "where is the king of France?" I call that the royal synecdoche. Hendiadys. Now this is a good example of why you should not go to graduate school. Or if you go to graduate school, for God's sakes, don't try to get tenure at a research institution, because you're going to end up doing academic scholarship and research, and after that you're not going to be any use to anybody. And I say that because I used to think I knew what Hendiadys was. I thought it was very simple. It was two nouns joined with "and," taking the place of an adjective and a noun. I thought that was it. Then I spent like 3 years researching an article on Shakespeare's use of Hendiadys, and at the end of that 3 years I can no longer tell you what Hendiadys is, because almost everyone defines it differently. Here is the broadest definition I can find for Hendiadys. The use of two nouns, usually two nouns, occasionally two adjectives or two verbs, joined by a conjunction, usually "and," sometimes "or," to express a single but complex idea. So the idea is you got two things that when you put them together, they create a whole greater than the sum of its parts. That is the test for whether it is Hendiadys. Reasonable people can disagree about whether it's Hendiadys or mere redundant doubling. But the examples here, I think, are clearly adding up to create a whole greater than the sum of their parts. From the Scottish play, Full of Sound and Fury. And from Hamlet, we have many, because there are lots of Hendiadys in Hamlet, to the point where we have Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, walking, breathing personifications of this rhetorical figure. Okay, two things making one. They're never apart. So in Hamlet, we have, "in the book and volume of my brain, the cheer and comfort of our eye." Precise definitions of this figure vary, but the test is whether the two things add up to create a whole greater than the sum of its parts. Metaphor, you are familiar with as English majors, the identification of one thing by another. We say of the sun, "Approach thou beacon to this underglobe." If we say the sun is a beacon, it's a metaphor. If we say the sun is like a beacon, it's technically a simile, but it's still metaphorical, so feel free to note it on your text analysis. Onomatopoeia, I love this one, when sounds convey meaning. Words like screech and howl sound like what they mean. Then we have patterns of repeated words within and between lines. These all have technical names which you are welcome to learn but not required to use. Okay, so I put a cheat sheet of grammatical figures in the file section of our Canvas page. If you want to learn the precise names for all these figures of repetition, you are welcome to do so. I don't expect you to. You can leave that for graduate school. If you like this sort of thing, I know a graduate school you can go to, you'll do nothing for 3 years but study these early modern rhetorical figures and their various definitions. It's enough for me that you tell me how the words are repeated. At the beginning of subsequent lines, at the end of subsequent lines, at the beginning and middle of a line. Okay, see below how such patterns interact with antithesis. I will say this about repetition before we go on. Skillful
writers and speakers still use this today. Barack Obama often used the rhetorical figures, including epistrophe, which is the repetition of the words or phrase at an end of a line. I remember in 2016, when he was campaigning for Hillary Clinton, he would say, "I am not on the ballot, but hope is on the ballot. Change is on the ballot. A better future is on the ballot." That particular repetition at the end of lines is called epistrophe. Mr. Obama, I believe, became comfortable using that kind of language through his exposure to the African American ministerial tradition, because the only place in America today where you will hear language used with the same kind of rhetorical skill that we're going to encounter this semester in Shakespeare is in the pulpit of a black church. Okay? So you're saying, how do you know, Falaco? I shall tell you how I know. So my last job was at an HBCU, a historically black college that was affiliated with the AME Zion Church. And every Wednesday we had to drop what we were doing and go to church services. They didn't call it church, they called it assembly. They can't fool me. It was church. I did not appreciate being forced to attend religious services against my will, but I did appreciate the rhetorical skill of my colleagues in the religion department, because they used all the rhetorical figures we're going to see this semester. And when I know the names of these figures, I'll tell you. Anaphora, repetition at the beginning of the line, epistrophe, repetition at the end of the line. We're going to talk about isocolon and gradatio. They used all of these things in a way that most people in public discourse in 2021 have lost. Once again, I digress. Okay, then we have antithesis. John Barton has said that the key to making sense out of Shakespeare, and this is certainly, I think, true for actors, I believe it's true for readers as well, because ultimately what we're doing, these plays are not literature, they're not written to be read, they're written to be performed. So if you read them well, what you're really doing is listening to a performance in your head. And the key is antithesis, the way words are placed against each other. As it says here, when words are placed in opposition to each other to enhance their meaning. Antithesis is the most common verbal figure in Shakespeare. It occurs in virtually every speech. Sometimes it's hard to see because there's so much of it. It's literally a case of you can't see the forest because of the trees. Every pattern of repetition will signal antithesis of either the repeated words or, more commonly, of the words not repeated. So, for example, in the phrase, "One woman is fair, yet I am well. Another is wise, yet I am well. Another virtuous, yet I am well." The words placed in antithesis to each other are fair, wise, and virtuous. And that quotation, which you may have recognized, is a speech of Benedick's from Much Ado About Nothing, a play that's written almost entirely in prose. Because where antithesis is common in all Shakespeare, it is hyper-prevalent in prose passages. The best example of which is probably Brutus's funeral oration in Julius Caesar, which is all based on this very tightly structured antithesis. And finally, we have two kinds of puns. We have atanaclasis, which is a pun on a homonym. To pray for you ever, I cannot refuse. To prey upon you, I should do much abuse. Punning on pray, P-R-A-Y, and pray, P-R-E-Y, homonyms. Two words that sound the same, but have different meanings. Then we have my favorite, paronomasia, the pun on a slight sound change, as when Hamlet says, "a little more than kin and less than kinned." Yes, most actors you will hear today say kind. The word is actually kind, related to the German word kinder, meaning children. Because what's just happened is Claudius speaks of Hamlet. He says, "Now, our cousin Hamlet and our son." And Hamlet says, "a little more than kin and less than kin. I'm a little more than your cousin and less than your son because you're not my real dad," which is what that play's all about. All right, so if we do this analysis, you will get this kind of result. Okay, so in this page here, I've gone ahead and scanned this speech, this 14-line speech. Okay, and on the next page, who is it that wants to look at Word documents spread over 2 pages when they could just look at them at 1 page. Because I was trying to minimize it just a little bit so I could get it all up on the screen at once, but then when I did that, of course, it went to 2 pages. So here is the speech that I paraphrased for you last time. I have scanned it here, okay? In the notes on page 11, I tell you what these scansion marks mean. But again, I can't stress this enough. The regular pattern dash x 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 dash x. Okay. Now most of the lines go like that. Now there are some exceptions that I'm going to note here on page 11, but most of the lines are regular. 50% of the lines are regular. Okay, lines 1 and 2, as I read them, are completely regular. Now entertain conjecture of a time when creeping murmur and the pouring dark. Then lines 3, 4, and 6, as I read them, contain this pattern where we have a trochee followed by a spondee. So I would not with line 3 say, fills the wide vessel of the universe, because it seems to me scansion is an art. It's not a science. Reasonable people can and will disagree on how a given line should be scanned. So some of the things I'm going to point out here are just correct. Some are my interpretation. So you could make the case, and that's okay. That's okay if you make interpretive choices, as long as you understand that most of the lines are ultimately going to be regular. Okay? So here I have fills the wide vessel, okay? Because I think fills is more important than that. I think wide and vessel, those 2 syllables are equally important. Fills the wide vessel, okay? Similarly, in the next line, from camp to camp, through the foul womb. In line 6, that the fixed sentinels. So that pattern repeats a couple of times. Lines 8 and 10 begin with a spondee, which heightens the repetition and antithesis. Now this, I would suggest, is just right. I don't think you could make a case for reading these lines as if they were metrically regular, because the whole point of this speech is we've got the English army and the French army. So during this speech, we talk about the English camp, the French camp, the English fire, the French fire, the English horse, the French horse. We need to give those something approaching equal weight. Okay? So lines 8 and 10, rather than saying fire answers fire, fire answers fire. Similarly, line 10, steed threatens steed. And as I mentioned in the note, this gives you some indication of how complexly the figure of antithesis works, because we have the obvious antithesis between the English fire and the French fire, and the English steed and the French steed, but then the whole phrase fire answers fire is placed in antithesis to steed threatens steed. Anytime you've got a list in Shakespeare, you almost always got antithesis between the items in the list, and usually, not always, but usually they build. So fire answers fire. Steed threatens steed. And earlier above we had from camp to camp. So there's all kind of build. Then we get to line 11. This, I think, is, some things about scansion or judgment calls, but here's one thing you can take as a rule. That whenever the first word in a line is a 2-syllable word ending in ing, that word will always be a trochee, okay? Because we don't say walking, talking, drinking. We say walking, talking, drinking. Same thing here with piercing. We wouldn't say piercing the night's dull ear, piercing the night's dull ear. Now, I've also chosen in this line to make this foot, dull ear, a spondee, 2 stress syllables, because it helps stress the monosyllabic quality of this line. And throwing a lot of information at you today, and this is not an acting class, so I don't expect you necessarily to learn how to act this semester, but the one thing you should always remember about performing Shakespeare or simply reading Shakespeare out loud, which you will someday need to do for your students, is that when you hit monosyllables, it means you must slow down. And this is especially important for people like me who tend to speak too quickly. Because when you get to, like, when Titus Andronicus says, villains, I shall grind your bones to dust. You can't say that quick. It's a crime against humanity. You're throwing away all those beautiful words. Often the most important information in the play is in monosyllables. Hamlet's father's ghost appears to him and says, Hamlet, the serpent that did sting thy father's life now wears his crown. But most important information in the play. Claudius did it. And that information relayed in monosyllabic words with long vowel sounds. Now wears his crown. But very important information. Monosyllables must slow down. The final lines, as I note here, are, as I read them, completely regular, which supports the onomatopoeia in line 13. With busy, hammers, closing, rivets up. Here you've got that whole phrase, sounds like what it means. So typically we don't, when you're acting, you don't want to hit the rhythm quite that hard. But here I think is a case where you can really exaggerate. Busy, hammers, closing, rivets up. So then moving beyond scansion, there's a lot of onomatopoeia in this speech. We have the word murmur. Everybody say the word murmur 3 times. Murmur, murmur, murmur. Sounds like what it is. Nays. Now, I'm not saying you should act this speech like steed threatens steed and high and boastful. Nays! They will come put you away. But you can get away with a little bit of vibrato. High and boastful nays. We have hum. Sounds like what it means. Whispers. And the onomatopoeic phrase, busy hammers closing rivets up. We have the repetition of words in rapid but not immediate succession. Now, the technical term for that is probably diacope, but there's another figure of repetition called ploche that's almost the same. So this is why I don't try to teach you these definitions, because A, Shakespeare didn't care about the rules. He always bent them to suit his purposes. And B, as Humbert Humbert says to Lolita, life is very short, and we don't want to waste our time in a spitting contest about whether a given figure is ploche or diacope. Nevertheless, I believe this to be diacope. Camp to camp, fire answers fire, steed threatens steed. So rapid but not immediate succession. If the words are right next to each other, camp, camp, fire, fire, steed, steed, that is epizeuxis. You don't have to know that, but I will tell you when I know. We talked about the antithesis. We have the pun atenoclasis, pouring dark, the pun between P-O-R-I-N-G and P-O-U-R-I-N-G. And the pun there works with the metaphor I have at the bottom of the page, the wide vessel of the universe, where the darkness is kind of pouring out of the vessel. And finally, we have the odd and probably misogynistic oxymoron, foul womb. Womb, beginning of life, should be something good, but here it is a foul womb. All right. So if we do this work on a speech, we paraphrase it, we scan it, and we analyze its poetic and rhetorical values, then when we perform that speech, and again, this is not an acting class, but I'm doing the same analysis with you I do for actors. To read Shakespeare well, you need to read it like an actor. And again, most of you are going to end up teaching. So when you read Shakespeare for your students, it ought to make more sense to them when they hear it than when they read it. And if you're going to do that, then before you do, you need to do this kind of analysis. And when you do, when I read this speech for you now, hopefully you will hear the fruits of the labor we've just done. You'll hear in my reading the scansion, the paraphrase, and the text analysis that I've just done. Now, entertain conjecture of a time when creeping murmur and the pouring dark fills the wide vessel of the universe. From camp to camp, through the foul womb of night, the hum of either army stilly sounds, that the fixed sentinels almost receive the secret whispers of each other's watch. Fire answers fire, and through their paly flames each battle sees the other's umbered face. Steed threatens steed in high and boastful nays.
piercing the knight's dull ear, and from the tents the armorers accomplishing the knights, with busy hammers closing rivets up, give dreadful note of preparation. So hopefully you can hear me putting into practice the fruits of this analysis. And if you're ever going to act Shakespeare, you need to do this kind of work. And if you're going to teach Shakespeare, you need to do this kind of work. The material is simply too good. Okay? So once again, what you need to submit online is this assignment, okay, in this format. First page looks like this. We talked about the paraphrase last class. You see the scansion marks I taught you how to do today. Second page looks like this. This page is the answer to the text analysis questions on page 8 of your syllabus. This is due at 6 a.m. on the 27th. Don't wait to the last minute. Best time to do it is before 5 p.m. on Tuesday, the 26th, because I have office hours from 1 to 5 p.m. on Tuesday. That way, if you have a problem, either a problem understanding the assignment or, God forbid, a technical problem trying to submit it online, you can call me and I can help you. After 5 p.m. on Tuesday, you're going to be on your own. So just like everything else in higher education, don't wait until the last minute. Now, the last thing I want to talk about today is the first play on our syllabus, which is Othello, which is a problematic play for a couple of reasons. One reason is it is an open question to what extent it is a play about race, and also to what extent it is a racist play. I don't have a clear answer for either, but in terms of how much is it a play about race, we then have to answer the question, what race is Othello? Now, we all know there's no such thing as race. There's no scientific definition of race. It's a cultural construct, but let's face it, it's a very important cultural construct that governs much of our society today, and arguably there are echoes of these same issues in Shakespeare's play. Now, we know that Othello is a Moor, okay? Unfortunately, that doesn't tell us that much, because the Moorish kingdom stretched from Morocco in North Africa all the way to Mauritania in sub-Saharan Africa. So Moorish people looked all kinds of different ways. There is a photograph. Where did it go? I had it here. Oh, I know where it went. Ah, mother of Christ. See, this is what I don't like about teaching on cannot minimize Zoom while you're recording the meeting. Okay, you're going to have to take my word for it. And I will show you this in class, but there is a portrait of a Moorish ambassador who visited England about the time of this play's composition. And you'll see, if you come to class, in that portrait, that the man in question does not look what we would call black. He looks to me like the American actor F. Murray Abraham, who was half Italian and half Lebanese. So Othello may not, Moors are not necessarily what we in America would identify as black, but yet Othello is referred to over and over and over and over again in the text of the play as black. Now, black meant many things to the early moderns. They would sometimes describe white people with dark hair, like I used to have, and dark coloring as black. But there's no doubt that in the world of the play, Othello is racially different from all the other characters. He's referred to over and over again as the Moor. He is the only one. I think for the play to make sense, we need to see him as a black man living in a white world. Now, there is no doubt that there are characters in the play who say terribly racist things about Othello. It is unclear whether the play endorses those racist views or not. I'd like to think not. I can't really make up my mind.
There are some Shakespeare plays I won't teach. I won't teach Taming of the Shrew. It's too sexist. I won't teach Merchant of Venice. It's too anti-Semitic. I can't make up my mind about Othello. I do know that the last place I taught was an HBCU. The students were all black. They liked the play, and they saw the play as being primarily about the impossibility of assimilation. Because Othello does everything he could possibly do to make these white people like him. He saves their country, okay? Kind of like Barack Obama, and yet they still treat him as an outcast. And one thing that I find fascinating about the play and that I think is worth discussing is when we read the things that are said by and about Othello, they echo things that we hear today, which unfortunately leads us to the conclusion that maybe we haven't come as far in the last 400 years as we would like. But ultimately, I think the play is worth reading, if for no other reason. It gives us an opportunity to talk about race, which is something most of us would rather not talk about, but which we really cannot avoid. Okay, thank you very much.